Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Javier Ayub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabit. Here's the episode. Hey everyone, so this is a conversation with previous guests on the podcast, Lina Mounzer and Timour Azhari. We decided to speak about the legacy of the Great Famine of Mount Lebanon, as it is called. The episode is pretty long, so I won't spend too much time introducing it. I'll just say that this is a conversation about the Great Famine, obviously, which took place between 1915 and 1918. But it's not just a conversation about that. As usual, on this podcast, we used it to sort of talk about its legacies today, how we get to think about it, what does it mean to think about it today? Are there any kind of quote-unquote lessons that we can draw from, and so on and so forth? I really think you will enjoy this episode. It is not limited to only like Lebanese people or people who care about Lebanon or anything like that. This is just a conversation about an event that happened 100 years ago and how three people that are linked to it in one way or another are thinking about it. So I think basically this episode has something to say about not just Lebanon, but the state of the world today. I will also briefly say that this is the last episode until September. The podcast will be off in August, with the notable exception of the very first week, because I will be re-releasing the conversation that I had with Lina Mounzer, which we recorded right after the explosion last year of the port of Beirut, as a first-hand testimony, given that August 4th will be 1 year since that horrific event. So it's gonna be the exact same episode as last year, but with a new introduction that I will have recorded by then. Thanks a lot for your support, everyone. This podcast really wouldn't be possible without supporters on Patreon. Again, people who are able to donate, please do so. It's on patreon.com/firethesetimes, and I'll see you all in September.
My name is Lina Mounzer. I am a writer and translator, and I'm coming to you from Beirut. I can't think of anything else right now to introduce myself with.
And my name is Timour Azhari. I'm a journalist based in Beirut. I work with the Thomson Reuters Foundation now, and I also sometimes host a podcast called the Lebanese Politics Podcast, but we've been quite bad about that recently.
So I've been thinking a lot about how to actually even do this episode. So that's not just a conversation about quote-unquote the past. And so I have a bunch of notes down and stuff, but pretty much we'll just figure it out as we go along. And by an actual coincidence, and you two can testify to that, because we were postponing and everything until we found a time that was convenient for the three of us. This episode is going to be out the last week of this month of July. And so the week after that, obviously, is going to be the commemoration of last year's explosion. And after that explosion, of course, Lina came on the podcast like a day or two later, I think, and, spoke about it, and that happened. And so it's just the coincidence is kind of daunting on me as well. And I think there's going to be a lot of those, let's call them hauntings from now, because I'm going to use that term later as well. I guess I have some thoughts and stuff, but I'll first ask you two to just tell us what you know about the Great Famine, the research that you've done, kind of like your relationship to it, if that doesn't sound too weird. And then I have some thoughts to kind of get us started and stuff. So I'll be referring to primarily two things, like an article that you wrote, Timour, and a talk that you gave, Lina. So Timour, feel free to start, and Lina, you can follow.
So yeah, if we want to talk about the famine as a historical occurrence, and what led to it, what it was, I think generally a lot of histories of the famine will start in 1914, 1915 during the First World War, when there was basically a siege of Lebanon from the sea and from the land. From the sea by the British, by the Russians, by the French, and from land by the then occupiers, the people in town, the Ottomans. But what I found sort of in my research for this story that I wrote was that the factors that kind of enabled the famine or led to the circumstances that, let's say, exacerbated what was happening at the time really started before. And so you have to kind of look at Lebanon, this kind of strip of territory in the Eastern Mediterranean as part of the global system at the time, and the changes that were happening in the international economy and the way the markets were working. And so for a very long time, Lebanon had produced silk. Lebanon, had agriculture production, much of which was silk. And before moving to silk, there was subsistence agriculture. People would basically grow stuff so that they could eat. But what happened with Lebanon's integration into the global market was that basically they started producing and growing things to buy, to get money to then buy food. And so there was a greater distance between the people and the food that they were putting in their mouths. And so what you increasingly had was people living far away from what they needed to survive. And when you do have in 1914, my God, is it 1914 or 1915? It's
18, I believe.
Yes, exactly, 1915. When you have this the war break out between the Ottoman Empire, which had joined Germany during the First World War, and the Allies or the I believe they were called the Entente forces at the time. You had a siege laid to this area, and it basically prevented goods getting out. So it prevented the silk going to the European markets where it was sold at the time. It also prevented, goods from getting in. It prevented money from getting in, including remittances, which Lebanon already relied on at the time. And at the same time, you had the Ottomans in the country laying down all kinds of regulations that really prevented the movement of goods. And among those goods, chief among those goods was wheat. The Ottoman army pretty much requisitioned most of the wheat in town for their army, for the war effort. They also conscripted a lot of farmers, people who were supposed to, go to the fields and take the crops. And so when you remove people from the fields, you have a lot of fields that go, unharvested, exacerbating the crisis. And so it was basically this confluence of factors that were socioeconomic, decades in the making. And then when the siege was laid, really the situation on the ground led to things to very quickly fall apart. And we get to the locusts, which of course made things worse. The locusts which tore apart large swathes of crops in the country. But what historians more and more are saying is that the locusts, though the sort of most jarring, most in a way, the most the most impressive image to come out of that weren't the biggest factor. And so yeah, I think that's sort of from my part. I mean, I guess the beginnings of what became known as the Great Famine.
So for me, actually, I want to tell the story a little bit differently with the reason that I became interested in it. So basically, the talk that I gave actually started as Sursock Museum was reopening after it was sort of like rebranding, redefining itself after it had been this sort of like fusty older place. It was going to become like another center for the arts. It was going to look at more contemporary art, and it sort of wanted to find its way back into the fabric of the city and become like really a museum, that to contend with, right? Like it's not just sort of old school anymore. And so the curator at the time contacted me, and they said that for the opening, they were doing all of these various different activities and they were working with different artists. And so she asked me if I would be interested in doing a narrative walk. And I said, what's that? And she said, it's just, it's you take a walk and you tell a story and that's it. So you can basically do whatever you want. And so I was like, I don't remember exactly what it was that led to me, and led me there. But I thought like, okay, I want to do a little bit of research about Sursock itself, because I'm going to be starting the walk from this house, which was the house of Ula Sursock. And so I wanted to find out a little bit more about this family. I just knew that they were very rich, and there was like this whole neighborhood that belonged to them. And, each of them had a different home on that street, like these very beautiful, venerable old houses. And I happened to read a line that said about like Michel Sursock had the grain requisition in Beirut at the time of the Great Famine, and he denies any he denies his involvement in the famine, and in exacerbating the famine. And I just sort of hit upon that sentence, and I found it very, very interesting. And so I went and I started to do more research about it, and I discovered, in fact, that Michel Sursock did hold, the grain requisition. And one of the things that he was accused of doing, which there's a lot of evidence actually that points to the fact that he did this, is that when there was like a wheat shortage, and, as Timour said, like the Ottomans had requisitioned all of the grain in order to feed the troops. And so they diverted it away from the people. So what he did was he started price speculating, as we're seeing now, actually, with the gas, with medicine, with all of these things. It's like, well, there's a shortage of this thing, so we're just going to keep, pushing the price up because we can, and so that's what he did. And it was just sort of shocking to me that how, first of all, these are the same names of like the big names of the big Lebanese families that are still, in power, and the way that power exchanges hands within this like very narrow class. And second of all, just the fact that kind of, just the mind-boggling cruelty of it, and the way that we were like now among these beautiful houses, and it was like, these fortunes, all fortunes really are built on the bones of the dead, and like on the exploited bodies of so many other people. But here it was like really stark. It was this, you have this beautiful museum. Hala Nula was the brother, or the cousin of Michel. So it wasn't his house, but like Michel's house was like right next door to what was the museum. And you worked really hard to sort of scrub this legacy away from the family, but like it remained, it sort of clung to them. And so my interest in it sort of came there. And Joey, one of the things that you had said is you said you're interested in this topic because of all of the parallels it has with today. What's actually even sadder is that, and also you were talking about hauntings, is that, so when I started doing this was in 2016, and that's when we did the walk in October 2016, and that happened to be the 100th anniversary, what's considered the 100th anniversary of the famine, because it was at its height in 1916, 1917. So the war was from 1914 to 1918, but those 2 years were actually the worst. And the locust plague didn't happen until like the famine was already like badly underway, like all of the factors were already there. And I think that's why, that's why it became so sensationalized, as Timour was saying. Like it became this like very jarring image of like the locust plague, of this place that is already falling apart, and already so many terrible things have happened. And then on top of everything, you have a locust plague, which is again very much parallel with today, But back then already in 2016, the parallels were so jarring to me, because we had just seen the garbage protests that had happened. I remember that image of, the women who had been throwing bread at Jamal Pasha to show him what they were eating, and he had them flogged. To me, this was very much in line with people protesting and being punished for protesting, and sort of throwing garbage at the doors of like the Ministry of Environment downtown. And there were so many parallels already, and it just boggles my mind that it's just it's something that has just continued, and those parallels just continue to pile up. Instead of, we're not like moving away from sort of the eye of the storm, we're going deeper into it, and the deeper we go, the more these parallels layer over it. So it's interesting, like Timour is coming to it from sort of like looking at Lebanon within sort of like a larger context, and the role that it played within the war, and within sort of all of the geopolitical changes that were happening at the time. And yet at the core of it also, what you see is this very Lebanese story about power, about wasta, about who owns what, about who is profiting off of other people's misery, like very deliberately. So who is getting rich off of that? you know, and then passing themselves off as these benevolent patrons of the art. Yeah.
And it's also the story of like Lebanese amnesia. And if we talk about what actually like drew me to this, like to write this piece and to even like look into the famine, it was kind of this issue of like amnesia, and there not really being a like proper like history or a memorial really to this place. And, you know, I had come across this place near the French embassy, which is like the thing called the memory tree, which was supposed to be inaugurated in 2014 and then delayed for many years because of Lebanese political bickering about who would get to go to the opening ceremony. Are we going to include the Turks? Are we not going to include the Turks? Are we targeting the Turks by opening this memorial? And this memorial, it's this like quite beautiful structure with these bronze leaves that are Arabic calligraphy by Yazan Halwani, who's this Lebanese artist. This structure remained draped in this white tarp, basically. And Yazan and other people would periodically go and remove the tarp, and then Lebanese authorities would put the tarp back over it because it had sort of never been officially inaugurated. And so I heard that story, and at the same time, I came across this town like near Jbeil in the north, which is a town called Jarrin. And it's this town that's sort of very small. It's on this green shoulder of a hill. And it's basically these like skeletal looking remains of these homes. And I remember going there and then like just Googling it. And there was all this talk of this town being a ghost village where people had left overnight during the famine, where they had run out of grain and they set sail for the Americas, and they either sank or they made it. And I remember sort of like being very struck by that. And it's a place, I would encourage people to go there. There's several things that were striking about it. And first of all was that you have this old town, this archaeological site, which is not protected in any way, there's no signs telling you what's there. No, like you can't even find anything about it online on like Lebanese government websites. And it just struck me. It reminded me of the panels that we have in downtown Beirut near the Roman ruins. So they set up these metal panels, which used to have like writing about the Roman ruins, telling you like, putting words to what you see in front of you. For years, those were empty, right? And it's just this thing of like not caring about the past, not caring about telling the story. And I was like, okay, like this place seems really interesting. That was my introduction to the famine. It was kind of as with a lot of like the stories that I get in on, it's usually from a place of like deep anger and frustration at something being off. And this just seemed like that. It seemed like this town was just left, to be sort of like destroyed by time, forgotten, and like no, this is a story that has to be told. Especially, I think, because we're all living through a period which seems very cataclysmic, and so, yeah, just to talk about how I got introduced, I guess, to the famine in this way. And then, of course, I went and I watched Lina's amazing talk, quite a troubling talk, and read pieces by various people. But yeah, that's, frustration and anger, mm-hmm. I'd say are the emotions that I felt then and still feel today.
Mm-hmm. This it perfectly, I wanted to make a point to, so I have a lot of thoughts on what you said, and one thing that I really got out of like Lina's talk as well is this attitude that a lot of Lebanese had, especially after the Declaration of Independence and so on, of kind of like let's let bygones be bygones and not really think about what the Lebanese did within. And so the myth kind of developed that this was just kind of an external thing imposed on the Lebanese people. And of course we've seen this discourse, let's say, repeated over and over again with all of the conflicts and all of the issues that came even after, right? 58, 67, civil war, everything is pretty much the fault of everyone else except us, etc., etc. And to sort of summarize what you just said, like basically from what I understand, there were four factors that made the famine what it is, or at least three, and then the fourth worsened things later on. Of course, the Allies blockading the Eastern Mediterranean, that was one thing. The Ottomans, Jamal Pasha, most notoriously, I suppose, barring crops from what is now Syria especially into Mount Lebanon, or the other parts of what is now Lebanon were also affected, of course. The role of local elites, like the Sursock family, and then, obviously, as we said, like the locust plague. Now, the parallels are quite something. I think you two already know that like the Sursock Museum, it's my mother who designed the stained glass in them. And of course these were destroyed during the August explosion. And the August explosion, part of why the blast happened the way it did is that the grain silos diverted part of the blast into one area of Beirut rather than the other, essentially. And so just the ideas of like, well, it's grains that, just the fact that there are even these parallels, it was actually, it did come down to grain silos, and not silos necessarily, but like to wheat and to grains and to just these basic subsistence that we need to actually just survive. And 100 years ago, those were used as a political tool, obviously, which is what happens in a lot of famines, and I'll get into this in maybe a little bit. Whereas last year is kind of like what protected one part of Beirut and what condemned another part of Beirut, or at least part of the story. It's just quite something, isn't it? It's just one of those things that I don't really have any other words other than hauntings, and that's why it's a word that I use. I even recently, last week, I watched Safar Barlik for the first time, the 1967 film, which features Fayrouz. And the plot is basically that, locals are suffering because of the Ottomans, kind of end of story. And it brought me back to Lina's talk, of course, while re-preparing this episode. I rewatched it. And there's a good essay, there's a good paper. I'll just read the abstract for listeners, just to kind of drive this point home of how common this narrative is, how common the story is. So it's a paper by Graham Armand Pitts, and it's called "A Hungry Population Stops Thinking About Resistance, Class, Famine, and Lebanon's World War I Legacy." So just the abstract. Conventional understandings of Mount Lebanon's World War I famine blamed outside forces for the tragedy. In particular, an Ottoman plot to starve the Lebanese has been the predominant explanation for the catastrophe. This view conflicts with how observers understood why the famine was happening as it unfolded. And of course, Lina, you mentioned a lot of those in your talk as well. A rapacious capitalist class used its control over the apparatus of the state to accumulate profits, while the poor and middling population of Beirut and Mount Lebanon faced starvation. The narrative that emerged subsequently deflected blame away from this class, which maintained its control after the war. End quote. Now, the whole blame away from this class, which maintained its control after the war, I could be talking about the 90s. I could really be talking about after the Civil War. I could really be talking about pick and choose whichever conflict you want, with some exceptions, that story definitely repeated itself. And so one story that you mentioned it now, Lina, like the whole Jamal Pasha ordered Beiruti women to be flogged because they threw bread at him, and the parallels to today, I suppose, just a few days ago in front of Mohammed Fahmi's house, the interior minister, for those who don't know. Okay, I have a lot of thoughts, and for now I'm gonna pin them. I'm just curious as to your thoughts as to some of these parallels.
I don't even know what to say, because there's so many. It's just I said this in this talk, and I sort of wrote it in another piece, but I really, really feel, I don't want to keep repeating myself, but it's like living here somehow. It's like the membrane between this world and the next world is rubbed really thin, and the next world is that place of sort of, I guess, the collective unconscious or whatever it is. It's where all the symbols and metaphors and images and whatever that that we all instinctively know, it's where they dwell. And it's what's happened is whatever keeps that world separate from this one has sort of been rubbed thin, and we're in this place of monsters and nightmares, and and it's you don't even have to write the story writes itself. It's like you said, there's all of these hauntings, all of these layers, all of these parallels, these things on top of each other, and it's almost this weird cyclical repetition of themes and motifs, and it's like an opera. It's like you keep coming back to the musical theme that plays, and you're now this is gonna happen. And it's I was thinking, the thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm not the only one who feels this way, because I've voiced this to other people, and they all said, oh yes, exactly, this is is last year when the explosion happened. Before that, there had been this long, hot, seething summer, and this sense of this pressure building and building and building. And I remember the first thing I thought when it was everything was rumbling and shaking and shattering, I had this very clear thought, and I thought, oh, here it is, here is the cataclysm, here is the disaster we've been waiting for. And And I think this was a collective thought that so many people had at the same time. Like even before, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what was like, I had several sort of thoughts flash through my head, but it was, you know, and it's like, it feels like this is the same thing that's happening again. And it's like with the famine as well, it's like all of these disasters that are laid on top of one another. And you have this completely indifferent political class. And I don't know if it's that people, I mean, I don't want to say political class because it's not, it's like, you know, it's a class of elites, a class of rich people, I don't know what you would call them, but like, and even the narratives that people use to explain it, like now when you were saying, you know, it's like this conspiracy, like it was the Ottomans and the British and the French. It's no different than the people who are saying now that it's like because it's like of a blockade and it's because of the Americans and it's because of this and that. And you know, and sort of explaining it away to innocent, the people who are like helping enforce essentially this starvation on everybody, on the entire population. And I don't even know what to say about it. It's just so boggling to see all of these things just repeat and repeat and repeat. And you just wonder like if we are in the realm of this like sort of almost magical, fantastical, like what is the incantation that's going to make it stop? And I don't know if it's memory, actually. I find it very interesting. Like this is a thing that I've been thinking a lot about. And like Timour now saying, you know, and we had talked about this before, right? Like it's this idea of like, Lebanon has an amnesia and it forgets the past, and you know, and that's why it's doomed to repeat it. But I don't know if that's true. Like I don't know if memory is the bulwark against repetition. I don't know what it is. Like what does it mean to remember something in a way that is going to allow us not to repeat it? I don't, you know.
For me,
anyway, that's just the thing I've been thinking a lot about.
So a big part of my own research is on memory, and that the whole question of again hauntings and whatever. And there is definitely a like it's been called the amnesia thesis. So I don't know if I used it, but other people use it as well, which is the whole idea that we just have an amnesia in Lebanon essentially, and we do. There is that. It does exist. I'm not saying, you know, there isn't.
It's not natural amnesia. It's an enforced amnesia, right?
Yes, yes.
Revisionism. Is the issue. Like people would remember, but there's just a concerted effort, clearly. To prevent that and to prevent there being a critical history of this country, you know,
which is why basically the conclusion is that the issue isn't necessarily just amnesia or not amnesia, but it's accountability or not accountability. It's like something is done about it or not. You know, the biggest problem with the end, quote unquote, of the civil war with the Taif agreement, whatever, it's not even that, which is already Taif agreement, lots of issues about it already. It's of course the amnesty law that followed it. That's the sort of stuff that prevents. And the protests of a few days ago are obviously and probably ongoing, and probably by the time this comes out, which is the end of July, probably gonna happen as well in terms of, you know, lifting the immunity and all of that. The story kind of repeats itself. And I don't know if you two know about a theory, or it's not a theory, but whatever. It's kind of it's both. It's a bit of a joke, but it's also a bit sad. But that since Declaration of Independence, there's been roughly a 15-year cycle between one horrible thing to another. So like obviously 43, and then 58, obviously the quote unquote mini civil war. And then a bit more than 15 years later, of course, the Civil War, which itself is 15 years, and then 1990, then 2005, obviously 2005 events, and then obviously 2020 events, and which is roughly like, you know, one generation essentially. And so it feels like these things are repeating themselves. And I couldn't help but always think, which is probably why it marked me so much, this short film by Lee Dere, you know, Waves 98. I've had him on, and I've mentioned this short film so many times, because there's this whole a ghost from the future and this thing that he keeps on repeating, like, I don't want to end up like them, i.e. his parents in that story. And yet he kind of does, or you know, it's I'm not gonna spoil it, but it's just one of those things that keeps on repeating themselves essentially. And that repetition, I think, is what lends the sense of helplessness and the sense of, well, it's all out of our hands anyway, even though we know that there are concrete reasons, you know, there was a concrete reason 100 years ago and there are concrete reasons now. Just the fact that it's happened so many times can definitely lend to the sense of, well, we can't do anything about it. which I'm not saying is correct, of course. It's just understandable that this is one of the feelings that ends up kind of coming to the surface.
Yeah, and there's also sort of like an individualization of the problem. So I remember when doing my research, I came across letters by Jesuit priests in 1914, where they were telling people to stop consuming meat, so like stop feeding, fodder to your animals, and to grow everywhere they could, including, on the roofs of their houses, wherever they could. And again, like history repeating itself. You have, the Hezbollah Secretary General announcing agricultural jihad at last year, basically telling people that the new religious war is one of this righteous struggle is one of growing things like corn. You had the Mayadeen, Al-Manar, the Hezbollah channel, doing this like ridiculous 2-minute poetic thing, telling people to grow various types of crop. You had the former foreign minister take a picture of himself with a scythe, hitting it into the ground. I mean, it's almost it's the same. It's almost a parody of it.
And the president calling it economic resistance, of course, last year or a couple of years ago or something.
Exactly, that we need to do economic resistance. And this thing of like, it's it also comes down to this idea of like, the Lebanese reliance on like private enterprise and private initiative, and how if you just let the Lebanese do it, they'll get it right? And it's just complete abdication of authority by the people in power. It's like all these individual initiatives, maybe will solve it, but they never can. You can never replace the state with volunteers or with NGOs, right? It just doesn't work. And if we want to talk about parallels, I mean, that's just another parallel. As Lina was saying, there are too many, and it's almost painful to go through them because you really do feel like you're stuck in time. But yeah, go ahead.
So I've been recently like reading or rereading Ghada Samman's Beirut Nightmares. So I'm reading it in English. If you want to talk about like parallels and repetition, there's some of the things that I read there, and I just, again, it's almost shocking the way that the kind of repetition of all of these things. So I had marked them, actually. I don't know if I can find it, but like one of the things that she debates in the book is something that we keep hearing now, which is like is there anybody innocent in a war, or is there anybody innocent in a sick society? And this is a question that is like asked again and again and again. But there's a part also, I can't find it here. Oh yeah, that's right, where she says, the big time criminals were those who had been insisting on dancing the debke on our dead bodies for half a century without so much as a change of leadership. And if such a change did occur, then their descendants simply inherited the kingdom of their fathers, cloaking themselves in the same Ottoman-like mentality and manners, which with age had grown musty and putrid. And so it was that no one was dying but the people themselves. There's no such thing as the innocent people or nation. Rather, our people had wronged themselves by being content for decades and decades to bear their executioners on their shoulders. And it's just insane to me. She wrote this in 1976, and we're having the same conversations and the same debates and the same, so these parallels are not just like 100 years ago and they're being repeated now. It's like you said, Joey, it's like these 15-year cycles, and it's just like this consistent and constant repetition of things that are like so similar. It's not even that the themes are similar. It's like it's almost the exact same things, and we see that with the same names and the same, it's just it's cursed. That's it. That's like the only explanation. We're cursed, and we're living on top of a portal where time repeats, and there's a curse, and there's some incantation we're someday going to come up with, and it's going to break the curse, and we're going to live happily ever after. That's what I believe now.
So I mean, even when you were talking, for me that's kind of that's how I view that Khalil Gibran quote that you had mentioned in the talk. And let me find it. He collected donations during that time for people back home. He was from Mount Lebanon, of course, from Sharra. He wrote, and this is the thing that kind of hit home for me, like, what can an exiled son do for his starving people, and of what value unto them is the lamentation of an absent poem, end quote. Speaking as a quote unquote exiled son myself at this point, and the whole, like, after the explosion last year, I also spent, I don't know how much time just collecting donations, and there was really the sense, like, it wasn't necessarily writing, it was actually just the podcast. I had the only episode for that month was the one with Lina, because it just felt like, what else, what's the point, essentially, like, what is this thing going to do? And others kind of went the opposite, like, Beirut Banyan actually did like more episodes that month, so I'm not saying everyone had the same reaction, but that's just how I went through it. And so I guess I don't actually know how to ask this question. It's more, I think, more of a reflection. Maybe I can have some reflection on your part. Like, how do you view what you're doing in terms of your work, your art, your etc., with as either a coping mechanism, as like just dealing with it, bearing witness. Of course, this is an important element, and that's definitely how I view myself as well. So, like, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know how much I want to like make it about like myself, because it's, when like it goes without saying that like people like me who get to report and comment on these things rather than, you're still living them, but I guess living them to a lesser degree. We are in a very privileged group in this country, and to a certain extent, you need a certain distance, I think, to be able to report on things. But I don't know. It's honestly, it's been very, very strange as a journalist, going through what we've gone through as a country in the past 2 years, from like a period of immense hope, to very quickly being sort of thrown from that peak down to a deep, deep valley, and where it's really, really dark. And then while you're there, everything blows up. And so like, I would say that there's a definite sort of, I'm very lucky to have had the ability or the drive to like report on these things and like cover these things to bear witness, because I don't know what I would have done otherwise. And I think that otherwise maybe I would have, I'd like to think that I would have been on the front lines, like throwing the rocks or whatever it would be, but I don't know what I would have done. And I would say that increasingly it's become more and more difficult to do the job, because you just feel like things are repeating themselves. There was a period where we felt that things could change. And the reason I do journalism is because I want things to change. And once you feel that no longer is possible, and I think that for many people that was after the blast, a few months maybe after the blast, because we were all sort of scrambling afterwards. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to move after that. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's, in the end, you find a way to like keep going forward, and things do. And like, there's this whole idea of like being on the brink, and you're not there yet in the crisis. And I think that more and more people are realizing, no, we're there, but there's never a there, it's just this like perpetual downward stagnation. And that's something that's difficult to report on. I mean, just from a sort of a writing point of view, once you've used every adjective and you tried to get in some expletives, once you've said that things have collapsed and exploded and imploded and insert word here,
on the brink.
Then it's literally, and today things are a bit worse. And that just, I mean, so what do you do?
Yeah. I have the greatest admiration for you, Timour, and other journalists who are sort of like on the front lines and reporting and sort of taking up the mantle also, and speaking to people who are not in the privileged position that we are. And I can't even imagine, because just reading the stories, sometimes I feel like I can't function anymore. So to sort of be out there and to be speaking to people and to be bringing their voices to other people, I feel like there's always a transference that takes place. And I don't know how people are able to like carry that in their bodies, in order. So like, hats off, because I myself have been just incredibly paralyzed, and I don't really have the words for it, basically because I don't really have words anymore. And I feel very, I I don't have the words for it, because I just feel, writing is my coping mechanism, and it's the way that I make sense of things, and it's the way that I understand the world. And maybe to a certain extent, Joey, like you said, bearing witness, although that's also one of the things that I think about, like, what does it mean, and what is its point, and what is, like, in terms of like when material sustenance is like so desperately needed. But anyway, that's not, for me, it's not even philosophical questions now that are sort of holding me back. It's not like, well, what does it even mean? I'm just completely run down. The thing that I keep thinking about is that it's not even thinking about, it's like what I find so hard to sort of bear the weight of, or is everybody else's misery. Like, there's mine, but there's everybody else's misery. There's just this collective sense of sinking, and it's again, it's like I was talking about, like the membrane between this world and the other. It's just whatever illusion that you have, that that your comfort is sort of like khalas, it's you realize that everybody's comfort has always had at the expense of so many other people's pain, and like that pain is like your nerve endings can feel every bit of that pain, and it's impossible to function. Like, sort of just this morning, actually, I was having this like a conversation with a couple of friends of mine on WhatsApp, and one of them said, she's like, I have this, she's like, please don't judge me, but is it okay that I feel really annoyed when I see, our friends having fun abroad? And I said, no, I get it. I get it. And she's like, I can't, she's like, these people that I love, and I know that their hearts are here, but I see like their Instagram stories, and, they're having a picnic in the woods somewhere, and I'm just enraged, And I said, no, I get it. I mean, it's not, and we were trying to figure out sort of where does that feeling come from? And it's because you're angry and sort of just kind of like you have all of these emotions roiling in you constantly. And of course you're angry at the situation, and you're angry at this like vast lack that we are living with, like there's no electricity, and there's no water, and there's no this, and like what shows you what a giant crisis this is that even people who have more money than others, like who make money in fresh dollars, or who their quality of life doesn't really improve. You still have no access to electricity, no access to water, no access to fuel, no access to, like you're not starving unlike other people, but like there's so many, like just all of the bare basic things of your life are still kind of, so yeah, for me, I've just felt completely paralyzed. And it started with the beginning of the year. I think it was, I was under no delusion that the new year would bring something different, but there was something about like that clock ticking from midnight to like, midnight and 1, and it's like, we're in 2021. I think that was the moment where I realized, I'm like, oh, we're at the beginning of this descent, and yeah. And it was just like, like Timour also was saying, it's hard to explain what it felt like from going to like the peak of like somewhere to like this very like low kind of abyss, and to just be, I think about it as sort of, we had these two like completely imagination defying events, and these have bookended that. And I feel like that does something to your mind. Like for me, like the uprising, what it did was, it was like, I didn't know that my imagination was capable of all of these things and these colors and these ideas, and it just completely shattered everything that had sort of held me in check, or the way that I saw myself or the country, or the possibilities of myself in the country. And like, it just, and it was like sparkles and electricity and, and all of these things just sort of like shimmering, and like a million dimensions I hadn't been aware of. And then on the other side of it, you had the explosion, which was just, it's like, what's your worst nightmare? There's worse. What's the scariest thing you can think of? It's way scarier than that. Like and the most terrible possibilities are there. They're like, there's no such thing as saying like, oh, it's illogical to think that this might happen. Like everything is now possible. And I just feel like my mind doesn't really function anymore. Like between this pole and that pole, something has happened. I've lost language. I don't know, it's like you can't rely on metaphor when like metaphor is the thing that you're living now. It's almost like being in like this upside down sort of like Escher painting where you don't know where up is or down is or anything. And I just like, yeah, so I'm not coping like at all. I'm not like the amount of work that I've managed to get done this year is like less than what I did in a month last year, maybe. Like last year I was very productive, especially like right after the blast. I was sort of like, there was adrenaline carrying. Like now is like, I get a message, I answer it like a week later. Important emails just sort of fall by the wayside. Like just, and I'm sort of looking at like my life kind of just slipping in between my fingers. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, I don't care. It's like, I'm living on a different planet now and like nothing matters here, but everything matters. And I know that like, this is depression, but I'm not personally, I don't know how to explain it. It's not a personal depression. It's not like, I know that it doesn't belong to me alone. It's not even if I have moments of joy myself, or it's like, things that I'm personally looking forward to, or it's almost like I've become this transparent thing. And I just feel like everything that we're all living is just like, I just become very permeable. And again, everybody around me is like, we're all just very permeable. Like that illusion of being an individual is just completely gone, completely, And so I don't know how to like gather the parts of myself back together into like a human shaped thing that knows how to write and knows how to put things into words, because it just doesn't anymore, Anyway.
I think that's just completely accurate, and I want to continue listening to you talking about it for like 30 minutes, because it's like digging up myself, like I like, for me, one of the big things is just the juxtaposition between what you call the vast lack of anything and just the potential for, and not, it's not even the potential, it's just the simplicity of the solution, actually. And that's kind of what kills me every time, is that it's the path is so clear. But we're just dealing with people who just are completely unresponsive. And like, it struck me what you said about how, people who even those who have like, dollars or a good job are living without power, or, some people can definitely secure it. But, I spoke to someone who basically is from a super rich family, and for months after the blast was living in like, one of those high-rise, skyscrapers in Sassine, but had no glass for months, and it's just like, what can you do? It reminded me actually of the famine a bit, because that back then, yes, you had the elites and the aristocracy who were like hoarding these goods, but you also had people in the north. I spoke to a historian from Jbeil who basically talked about how they were selling their boats, their houses, their lands for literally a few sacks of wheat. And once you get to a certain point where these things aren't available, everything breaks down. Like it doesn't
Absolutely.
matter.
Absolutely. And value shifts, right? Like you would think that, like there was one of the anecdotes, and it sounds like an anecdote to me, but like somebody had said that like there in Tripoli, there's like this big field like by the sea, and it's called Ard al-Bardane, because apparently like the man who owned it sold it for like 3 oranges or something to feed his family, which of course sounds completely outlandish, but then again, you never know, right? And it's like it's this world that we're living in here now as well, with the breakdown of the currency as well, where like you don't know how to ascribe value to anything, right? It's just, and I'm sure economically there's like an actual term for this, but for what happens when that happens. But like, yeah, it's like people will sell land for a sack of wheat. They will they will trade in like gold and goods for fuel or whatever. It's like, it's just, there's no sort of set value to anything anymore. It's just about how much you need it and what you're willing to give up in order to get it. And and that's it. It's true. Like wealth takes on, except of course, there's always this like taba'a of people that are just completely living above everything, as we're seeing now. They just, but yeah, even the people that are considered quite rich or who earlier did not have problems are now kind of, in the muck and mire with everybody else, and sort of there's this like competition over resources, and you have to try and figure a way out, and
yeah, and it's very hard to maintain a sort of collective sort of struggle or collective kind of movement in that, because a crisis like this, it feels like it pushes you naturally to hyper individualism, right? It's like if you can afford to give the guy 20,000 lira.
Oh my God, sorry. I'm going to turn on the AC because I'm sweating. Sorry, Timour, I really didn't mean to, but this is part of what we're living right now.
100%. No, it's just that. If you can afford to give the guy at the fuel station an extra 10 or 20,000 lira so that he fills your tank, you're going to do it. It's like things are becoming ever more stratified. You have the haves and the have-nots. But when the have-nots is such a huge category, I mean, I don't know. It's just, there are people today who are trying to create collective movements, and since the Thawra, they've been trying to do it. But it just seems very difficult when you're living this much in a sort of law of the jungle kind of situation. Like, how do you convince people that it's more important for them to come together and meet and discuss and push for something in the future when they're just trying to secure the thing that's in front of them? And Joey, this goes back to the article you quoted. I forget the name of it now, but it was basically the gist is like a hungry people don't.
A hungry population stops thinking about resistance. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. That was the title. Actually, you were saying. I'm going to read the abstract, and I wanted to say, like, the title itself speaks volumes. Like, it's,
Yeah.
I mean, so a number of things on the question of like the haves and the have-nots. Of course, we can probably do an entire episode on it, but I guess it's important to note just the as you mentioned, like just the difference between those two groups. Of course, in the have-nots, you can have, I guess it depends how you define whether the middle class are in the haves or in the have-nots. I suppose that by definition, sort of in between. But the distance between the haves and the have-nots that's one of the indicators. I mean, we're talking about famines and of course everything that we're talking about. And just last week, a group from Myanmar reached out to me to tell me basically that Najib Miati's family, which is the ex-prime minister, for those who don't know, bought a telecommunication network in Myanmar. And it's like, how do you, like, in my mind, it's like, where did you find the time to think about business deals? But that's how completely disconnected we are from those ruling elites, the oligarchs and the warlords and the ex-warlords and all of those. It is a different world. They live in a different world. For the most part, they don't have to deal with what most people are dealing with. And then, of course, with those most people, then, of course, you have further differences, like refugee, migrant, domestic worker, that it's not the same thing as being a Lebanese citizen, and a Lebanese citizen is not the same as being a poor person in the north or a poor person in the south. But there are these differences, obviously, but the similarities between all of those is even like greater, if you see what I mean, compared to the differences with those that are at the top. Like, just the notion of a Lebanese billionaire should be an insanity, like should be completely inconceivable, and yet we have a bunch of them, and half of them were prime ministers. so it's
from the one of the poorest cities on the Mediterranean.
Yes, Tripoli, yeah. And I mean, just yeah. So the other thing that I had is like it's kind of also another parallel, essentially, like just, of course, now all of us, I'm already in Europe, and I'm sure you and many others, like people listening who are from Lebanon, know people who are thinking of leaving or have already left. It's just something that's always there, and there's always been this sense, a bit of shame, a bit of survivor's guilt. I definitely have that. What's interesting to me, other than that, we can get into it a bit, but is the parallels between this, even that, and the parallels of 100 years ago, because the migration patterns that we're following, the migration routes. The reason why I have the Argentinian citizenship is because my grandfather was born in Buenos Aires. The reason why he was born in Buenos Aires because his father left during Ottoman times, that old migration, as we call it. And for the most part, I mean, the Gulf is a more recent arrival, but with the exception of the Gulf, those migration routes are the same, the exact same migration route to the Americas, North and South America, and into Europe and to West Africa as well. And so I don't know how to deal with the question of, it's not a question of really like to leave or not to leave. I think like that's a personal whatever, but it's more like when it gets to the point where people are thinking of leaving. Okay, let me ask it more straightforwardly. The question of to leave or not to leave, whether it's you personally or people that you know, how have you kind of wrestled with that question?
تفضلي.
Okay. I don't know. I wrestle with it. I wrestle with it all the time. You know, I was having this conversation with my mother recently, and she said, forgot how she put it. She put it in like a really in a way that sort of was like, oh yeah, of course, you're absolutely right. But you know, she was sort of saying like, you know, like the history of multiculturalism is a history of pain. Like the reason, you know, that you can have like vibrant multicultural cities and like, you know, and in other parts of the world is because, you know, these are all people who like, you know, these are all histories of pain. These are all histories of like having like, usually people don't leave home unless they really have to, right? There's, of course, there's many people who like enjoy adventure and they like, but like the vast majority of people, myself included, would prefer to stay put, you know? Like, and for me, it's really like, you know, I left, like the first time that I left Beirut was, I was made to leave Beirut. I left against my will. My parents wanted us to leave. They had been trying for years to try and get a visa. So I was like almost 11 years old and we left like just before the war ended. So like maybe about 6 months before the war ended. And it was like in the middle of like the worst part of Hadabron, and, you know, and we left. And I was desperate, like so desperate to come back. And somehow I convinced my mother that I could come back and like live with my grandmother and finish high school. There was like many different factors, right? So I came back, I finished high school, I graduated high school, went back to Canada, was there for just 2 years, and then dropped out of college, came back here, and have basically been here ever since. I left to do my master's, I came back. And then at one point I had a fellowship abroad. I left, ended up being 3 years. I came back. So for me, like in the quote unquote legend of my life, like that return to Beirut and like the inability to leave it, the inability to live elsewhere is almost like this thing that I've ossified into like mythology. It's like, I fought so hard to live here and I fought so hard to like make a life here. And, you know, and it's like, my mother, by contrast, and she left and she like was like, I don't understand why you want to go back there. Like we worked so hard to give you a better life, to try and get you out of there. You know, one day you're going to like go down on your knees and like, you know, thank the Lord for that passport, which I do, because I have a Canadian passport. So I can leave, right? Like I'm a very privileged person who can leave. And Farah Birro actually recently, she wrote this beautiful blog post called Across the Rickety Bridge. And there was a line in it where she said, you know, because I can leave and I have the privilege of being able to leave, I'm not allowed to complain that I left, right? Because I left easily, something like that. I mean, she put it very beautifully. And it's so true, right? Like, it's like, you can leave. And like so many people want desperately to leave. And at the same time, I'm so resentful that I would have to leave. Like, I left my goddamn family when I was like a teenager and I missed the hell out of them because I really wanted to be here. And like, I made that decision over and over again, you know, in order to be here. And it just completely kills me. Like now I feel like I'm at an age where I don't want to go. I don't want to go make new friends. I don't want to go abroad. I don't even know what I'm going to do. Like, you know, but I can leave, right? So it's like, this is the thing that I wrestle with. It's like, at what point am I going to say that it is like unlivable here, you know? And it's like, I wrote a thread about it on Twitter, and it's a thing that I was saying to a friend of mine before that. It's like, I feel like it's like a devil's bargain when you leave. It's like you have to give up part of your heart in order to like live a full life. And you know, I was saying this to a friend of mine in Berlin, and she was saying like, no, don't say that. Like, that's so defeatist. and like, you know, you can go to a new place and you can build a new life and you can be happy. Like, it's not, you know, people do that all the time. And of course she's right, but like from this side of the rickety bridge, to use, you know, Farah's metaphor, like very apt metaphor, it just like looking across and like what might be waiting on the other side is, it just feels so, it's just really to be forced to leave because some motherfuckers ruined your country and blew it up, and like there's no security and there's no stability, and like, and they insist on sort of, you know, continuing to rob everybody blind. Like the rage that entails is just, you know, it's just like so bitter. Like the heartbreak is so bitter. Like I don't want to leave like this with my tail between my legs because those fuckers won, you know. And at the same time, they won. Yani if I stay here, and you know, and it's like I don't know. I think for me the question is like, when I'm really unable to work as I am now, it's a thing that I start to think about more. It's like, well, what's my life worth if I'm unable to work? Like what shi'ani that I'm here? Like you know, what am I doing? Right? I don't know. It's a
there's no right answer, right? I mean, that's the point, is that like we're in this situation where like it's not black and white, obviously. It's like you know, there are a couple of things there that like, you know, I just wanted to start with, like, you know, Joey, you talking about your sort of like ancestry and like how you got this citizenship and the struggle behind that. And I remember also again talking, you know, to a historian who was telling me that, you know, people who left Lebanon during the famine, they made like really, really serious efforts to not tell their kids about it. They changed their names when they arrived in the countries they went to. They hid that identity and they tried to forget really, really hard because the things that they saw, first of all, were so difficult. I mean, you had, you know, historians were telling me about basically women going into prostitution, you know, like into sex work, and you know, things like that are not things that anyone wants to talk about in the first place. But there was this real intention of sort of forgetting and moving on and integrating and trying to build a new life. And you know, when I heard that, it struck me how different it was to the official narrative that Lebanese politicians, again, you know, try to lionize the diaspora as these Lebanese Neo-Phoenician explorers who left the country searching for opportunity, this sort of noble quest. Like, hell no, that is not the case, my friend. Like, and
I never thought about it that way. Yeah.
And they marketed that, you know, they would hold, Gibran Bassil would hold these conferences called the Lebanese Diaspora Energy Conference. And it was this semi-electoral, semi-self-promoting, but okay, also partly governmental initiative to try and bring in the diaspora once again and bring their energies into the country. And it just strikes me as so sort of like shameless in a way, you know, to sort of push people out historically and you know, by repeating the same actions today. And then demand of them to be the lifeline, right? And to be the people who keep this system afloat. And so that was part of it. And then on a more personal note, just, you know, I have a bit of a complicated relationship with, like, you know, being here and like being from here, because, you know, my dad is Syrian, like we have Lebanese ancestry. Like my great grandfather was Lebanese, and I didn't grow up here. I grew up abroad. I grew up in the Gulf, and I chose to came here. And I came here in 2014 during basically the height of the refugee crisis. And my friends here were mostly Syrians initially, and mostly Syrians who had left from Halab, from Damascus, because of the war. And I was arriving basically at a time where, you know, I was for the first time really in contact with my Arab identity, which I hadn't been with in the past. And I was meeting all these Syrians who were basically, you know, I would meet with them and the conversation would always go a certain way, like, you know, Inta min wain, where are you from? You're like, I'm Syrian German. You're like, okay, so you have the German passport? I'm like, yes. They're like, well, what the fuck are you doing here? Like, why the hell are you here? And so that question honestly has always accompanied me in Lebanon. The idea of like leaving and like having to, in a way, justify being here. And you know, it's a complicated relationship. I do have the German passport. I can leave anytime. And I have to say, like, it's definitely not been a sort of like sacrifice since 2014. There were many things that culturally and the music scene here, even at the time, the art scene, Beirut was a different place just 8 years ago, even 2 years ago, even yesterday. And so it's for a journalist again, and for a person who basically I put nothing in this world except for my commentary, which is again a position of privilege to occupy, and this is sort of the thing that honestly it feels disgusting sometimes, is that you are like a leech feeding off of the demise of a country, right? And so it's a question that I really ask myself often, the question of leaving, and you talked about like leaving with your tail in your legs. I mean I know that you weren't sort of saying that that's the only case. I guess the answer is that there's no answer, and it's basically up to everyone to find what they can do and how they can do it. And the diaspora have a super important role to play, not the role that Lebanese officials had set out for them, which is basically send money and ask no questions. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. It's organizing and sort of trying to disrupt those old networks that kept the system alive.
No, I agree with you, Anna. I think there's also the question of how you frame the leaving for yourself. And I think because I'm so angry right now, I can't see it except as just this terrible thing, because it's not a thing that I necessarily would. I mean, I was thinking about it before, actually, just in terms of, for other reasons. So it's more the idea of like being forced into it. But I do think that there's also like a very kind of like messed up and destructive narrative about like the leaving and belonging, and how they're always related to trauma here, and like how close you are to the epicenter of trauma. Like I remember very clearly like coming back in, like when I came back in 93, and I just started high school here, and there were the people who had lived through the war, and I was one of them, and returned. And then there were the people who had grown up abroad and had now come back, and were now returning like right post-war, and there was definitely this thing of like, oh, who lived through the war and who didn't, who has memories of this and who doesn't. And but I feel like as time goes on and you move away from that, like for example, with the blast, right? I don't want to call it, I still have a problem with that terminology, with the explosion, with the cataclysm. At first it was like, how far were you from the epicenter? And there were the people who were abroad when it happened, the people who were here, and the people who had close calls, and the people. But now I feel somehow, especially now that a year has passed, I feel like it belongs to every Lebanese. Like it doesn't matter where you were, or, like now that like the story isn't did you survive or did you not, like how close were you? Like in the beginning, there's that urgency, right? Like how close were you to dying? How close were you to sort of that sort of like the cutting horror of it, right? And now as we move away, it suddenly doesn't matter anymore. In a way, it belongs to everybody, that it just went into their life and completely like shattered everything. And that could have happened if you were very far away, if you were here, if you were there, and I don't know if there's a point to it necessarily, but I just like, it's the way that like our belonging is always mediated by like a closeness to the epicenter of like pain. And I find that very destructive. And I don't want, like, I need to divest myself of that form of thinking as well, and it's like, it doesn't mean anything.
I think it's a very interesting point, because there's Hotel California, you can check out anytime, but you can never leave. And I think that obviously has a negative connotation, but I think there's an idea there that leaving doesn't mean that you're leaving the cause, right? That's like, it goes to your point of, it doesn't matter how far away you were physically. It's that we've all seen the videos, we've seen the destruction, we've loved, like, it's, yeah.
True, but even thinking of it as a cause, and for me, that's like, I don't like whether it's, you know, it's more about like belonging. It's about leaving and still belonging to this place, and also the legitimacy of your belonging to a certain extent, you know, is that we all, there's always this like underlying question of everybody's legitimacy of belonging. And I feel it's very interesting because I feel like people are having so many more conversations about that now. And I'm really, I'm thankful and grateful to all the people that are having these conversations, and like all of my friends who are living abroad and talking about what it feels like to watch it from abroad, and, you know, and to be, and I think that it's interesting to have that tension between all of these different positions. And I'm really happy that we're all talking about it, you know, just because for me, it's like reassessing somehow these ideas that I have sort of ossified and that I've allowed to ossify and wasn't really questioning myself about. And like now you know, maybe it's in preparation or in the run up to leaving, but like just the way that we have all of these ideas also of guilt around staying, and like, you know, what does it mean to stay? Like, what do you, you know, in the end, it's like a very personal decision, right? Like, it's like, yeah, it's this idea of like helping or hindering a cause. Like, what's the cause? You know, if you are not actively fighting on the front lines of, I don't know, physically protesting or whatever, like, what is the cause that we are taught, not you, but like that we are talking about or thinking about in that sense, you know? And it's like to bring it back to like, you know, the issue of the famine, and it's like that diaspora that was abroad was playing a huge role in terms of not just gathering funding, but attention. Like, you know, and it's like there's the priest that I forgot, I can't believe I forgot his name, but like this priest who had written this book, I think his name was Father Antoun Yamin. Yeah. And I had translated part of his book, and I found it in the archive. And his book is written in this very outlandish way. And he tells stories, like some of them feel real, some of them don't. And a lot of people, like, later they criticized his book. They said, well, you know, he's a fantasist and we're not sure if the stories he told were true or not. But he says, I want people to see how low we have been brought. I want people to see how everybody is suffering. Like he wanted to draw people's attention to what was happening. And I feel like, you know, in a way, the diaspora, like, has always felt that responsibility to play that role, to be like, to reflect the light from abroad, to sort of bring it back here, to bring the attention back to this very tiny place that, in fact, sometimes I think we do get like an oversized amount of the world's attention, considering how small we are, you know. But then, of course, the Lebanese, the chauvinist Lebanese in me is like, but of course, we deserve it.
You know, it's interesting. Sorry, but just the last thing on, like, when you're talking about, you know, the role of the diaspora in kind of bringing aid at the time, there's 2 points. First of all, I remember also in my research finding that local newspapers and local news at the time, because you were under Ottoman, you know, occupation, couldn't actually report the words, you know, famine as they were. They would have to talk about the crisis of food, or, you know, the issue of whatever it was, distribution, etc. Whereas if you look at the foreign press, and if you look at the press, you know, from like Cuba to Mexico, where you had, you know, people could write about this, they were talking about it openly. And so that is an interesting point. But then, you know, when you talked about the, you know, the role of the diaspora and bringing in aid, it just struck me that today you have people, because the situation is so terrible, and because the politicians are such crooks, actually saying, don't help, you know, do not provide aid, do not keep this alive, kill this, you know, and yeah, I don't know, it's just striking because it's so counterintuitive. Literally today, after the prime minister designate, you know, stepped down, Saad Hariri, after 9 months, I was just watching the TV news, and there was this protest, you know, in the street, people being interviewed, and the guy is like, we tell the international community, do not send any help, do not help us. And it's you know, it's just a crazy thing. I mean, what an upside down kind of, you know, country we're living in, where you know, where you have the situation where people are so done that it, you know, that they don't care anymore on that level, and because they know it's just going to be stolen. I mean, that's the thing, right? They know in their heart of hearts that it's not going to get to them.
I mean, we found out fairly recently that even the money that was supposed to go towards refugees, a bunch of it was absorbed by the banks. So,
well, there you go.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Well, that's why you have, like, you know, the networks of aid are individuals that are bringing money to their families, that are bringing medicine to other people, and you know, and it's like, I'm always so moved when I see on Twitter, for example, like somebody asking for medicine, and like how many people just come out and are like, I have some in my personal stash, I'm happy to give it to you. And you know, I'm just always very moved by that. I mean, of course, and then I start to think about all the people who like don't have social media and are unable to post there, and you know, yeah. Anyway, sorry, Joey, you were going to say something. I was just thinking about like formal versus informal aid networks, you know?
It's actually directly related to this because like both my dad and my uncle are now going back to Lebanon on a monthly basis, bringing back stuff to my grandmother and others, and some friends in Istanbul and some other friends in Paris also go back. And a friend a couple of weeks ago went back from Istanbul, and he, like, his entire suitcase was just medicine basically. And like this actually, like, it ties to what we're talking about, because I while you were answering the badly asked question, I figured out how to actually ask it properly, and it was the role of passports and how like from a young age, it was this entire thing of like, you know, get a passport even before getting a shahada, like even before getting a you know, your certificate, your graduation certificate. And even like Timour, you mentioned like the whole changing names and stuff. Like, so my my mom's family name is Hosseini, but in Argentina they're called Husseine. They changed it completely. It's actually not Hosseini anymore. And you wouldn't know unless you actually know what the history is. You wouldn't know that this is like, oh, this is actually from Lebanon or whatever. And this, of course, we've seen this time and time again in North America. Many names like Khouri would just be called something else, you know, Khouri or something else, you know. And there's no judgment on my part as to, you know, why people do that. That's not kind of the point. It's just interesting that we do have these in the same way. Like the way I describe it is that my parents who also grew up during the war, they didn't leave me that story. It was silences. I just inherited their silences. And there are other people who inherited a certain story of the civil war, of course, you know, like, you know, pro Hezbollah, pro Khater, pro whatever. They in certain historiography, as one scholar called it, sectarian historiography. In my case, it was just actually inheriting the silences. Like, we just don't talk about it. I didn't know who most of these people were, like On, Jaja, and the others. I discovered them when they came back to the scene in 2005, basically, when I was 14. And these things, I've seen the parallels. I've seen memoirs written like after the famine, or hearsay, or just scholarship or quotes here and there. And there definitely seems to be this kind of parallel. And the legacy of the famine in that sense, the whole always have a passport, always have, or try to get one, make sure that you have one, and then you can come back and at least you might leave. This kind of was brought home to me time and time again in 2006, 2006 war. A bunch of people, of course, managed to leave on the boats. We didn't go, but we had the option. The Argentinian embassy called us and said, like, if you need it, let us know, and you will go on the American one or whatever it was. And it's kind of, you know, I think like I can go back and back. You know, there's Ilain, the 1957 movie, which is set in the late 1800s, I think, or early 1900s. It's before the famine, I believe. And it's also the same story. A guy goes to Brazil and he leaves the family back home. And the story is of the family, actually, how they're dealing with it. So, yeah, it gets repeated. I can just jump through time, essentially. And we're definitely seeing these parallels. They're not the same. You know, I'm not comparing the famine of 100 years ago with today. Like, I don't even think we mentioned it. I'm not sure, but just so that people understand, we're talking about like some 50% maybe of the population of Mount Lebanon basically dying. It's a pretty stark, huge percentage. And of course, other parts of Lebanon as well, but just Mount Lebanon had this huge percentage. And so we're talking about the decimation of entire thing. And what happened after, I will have him hopefully, Akram Khater, he's a Lebanese American scholar, who I forgot the name of the center. I'll find it and put it in the blog post. But he studies like diaspora and migration and all of that. And he has this really good book that actually looked at the role of the Lebanese diaspora, some of whom came back to Lebanon, of course, after the famine, after World War I especially. And many of them brought back certain ideas. Many of them developed newspapers that were set up in the diaspora. Khalil Gibran was obviously very, very well known for being part of a bunch of newspapers. And so the change was obviously overwhelmingly horrific, but some people actually managed to do something with it. And there was an entire movement, and I'll get some thoughts from you, but I wanted after that to then switch to the question I had on gender, because there's a pretty interesting dimension to this, if not a very distressing one. But one of the things that did happen also was these women's clubs that then popped up they already existed in capitals like in Beirut and Damascus and other parts in the region, but they kind of multiplied after the First World War and stuff. And part of that was because the diaspora, some of whom were coming back, or was just sending things back, and then that facilitated that kind of development. So the question that I had primarily to Lina, but Timour, if you know anything, feel free to jump in. We do know that there's a very gendered component to famines, to the Great Famine, the one we're talking about, but also in general, like the stories we're hearing about in Tigray now in Ethiopia are horrific. We mentioned how, of course, like many of them had to basically do sex work, but also were shamed for it and punished, there was some actual social repercussions. And there was, of course, these infamous stories of women eating children and all of that. And it was always women, it was never men. And I'm wondering if we can sort of talk a bit about that. I have another question about the role of who gets aid, or the question of who gets aid, because there was also a politics behind it, a very specific politics behind it, but which is like ageist and classist and everything. But I feel like that's a bit maybe too much to chew at once. So let's just start with the gendered component. What can you sort of tell us about it from your own research, from the talk that you gave and others, of how that manifested itself?
Well, it's always, for me, what's interesting is not necessarily like the content of stories, but like the themes that recur. And, so what I came across that there had been a lot of stories of cannibalism. And like you said, it was always women. It was always women eating their children, or eating, for example, the children of their neighbors, or, but when I did a little bit more research, there was nothing that was like actually demonstrably or verifiably true at all. Like there wasn't, these were rumors, and these were things that circulated, and and it got me really to thinking about like it's the way that this is sort of projected, if you will, on the female body. Like what you have is like the mother's body is supposed to nourish the child, and and the mother's body gives life. And so first you have like the sort of the absolutely horrific element is if even this like nurturing motherhood, femininity, whatever, that's supposed to like give life, then becomes that which eats the child. It's sort of like, it shows you how monstrous the situation is, right? Like it shows you how absolutely terrible it is. And at the same time, it as you see with sort of any kind of national crisis, you have like the woman's body is burdened with sort of carrying the honor of the nation. If the nation is brought low, it is brought low through the woman's body, and like the woman's body is itself, and also becomes a metaphor for that. And it's what I find sort of distressing and a little bit crazy is like, so we know right now that there's like a shortage of baby formula, right? And so people are unable to find baby formula. And a lot of the questions that have come up is like, well, why don't women breastfeed? And I've heard it come from very well-meaning, people. And at the same time, there's also like some sexist, horrible, terrible people who are saying, well, if women just did what they were naturally supposed to do and breastfed, then their kids wouldn't be starving, and there wouldn't be a problem for them, not having baby formula. So the whole idea of like nourishment and giving life and all of that, when it breaks down, and all of the very the commonalities, or rather the things that we see as fait accompli. I can't think of the things that are, shi badihi. I don't know in English. I can't,
it's just a fact. It just happens.
Yes, the obvious, exactly. The things that go without say, let's put it, the things that are, so when these sort of break down, you always find a gendered component to it. And I think especially when it has to do with food and famine and nourishment and, and all, so all of these things, when I was doing the research about it and the women who were like, I kept thinking of Lady Macbeth, when she like cries out to the, and she says, unsex me, like she says, and turn my milk into gall. Like those lines kept sort of going through my head. And it was this idea of like everything that is nurturing about women is connected to motherhood. And so it was like that motherhood that needed to be unsexed basically in order for her to commit this terrible crime, and it's like, it's the same thing as you see the horror of the famine through the stories of, well, this woman ate her child, well, this woman sold her body, well, this woman, and then by that same token, there was like the women who refused to sell their bodies, the women who starved to death rather than have someone besmirch their honor, or like, she died with her siblings because she would not like allow somebody to. So again, it's like women's body as metaphor, as like the entire sort of like the humiliation of the nation playing out in it, the horrible state that people have been brought so low that like women are reduced to eating children, like it's not as horrific when you say that a man ate a child, right? Because I mean, it is horrific, but like it's not as shocking, because it's like,
I see that.
It's but like when you say that, this woman, or like she ate her neighbor's child, it's like we're supposed to like implicitly trust women around children,
There's this historian, Melanie Tanyelian, who wrote several histories of the, like looking at it from several different angles of the famine, and she sort of broaches this gender component and basically talks about how the famine basically changed traditional gender roles of like woman caregiver, man does the work. And I think it was very interesting what you said about, like you have these sort of fantastical stories where it seems to be sort of, reality, but also just something that's almost too horrible to be real. And taking the themes from that. And I guess the theme there, which Tanyelian talks about in her work is, and I'll just quote it because I happen to have it here in my piece. She says, quote, "The war effectively turned the family from a locus of safety and security to a place of competition over food, as brothers denied bread to brothers and fathers and mothers were forced to abandon their children." She says there is no doubt as to how the deprivations severed the tendons of power and trust once joining family members and, by extension, communities. And I just think that that's so apt, and it goes, this idea of like nobility you were talking about, of how like the woman that doesn't sell her body or died rather than eat her child is put on this pedestal, but you're dealing with a situation that's so horrible, that like this is something that just naturally occurs, that people are reduced to a level where yes, they will take food from their child, or yes, they will, I mean, the actual instances of cannibalism apparently are like super, super low from what, historians say. But it seems to be sort of, the story gets told for that. The story gets told, yeah.
And if there were like the only times where they were able to say, well, maybe there was cannibalism here, it was never like killing someone in order to eat them. It was always like somebody had already died and people were so desperate that, but like generally cannibalism is like, because it's such a huge taboo, it is like, and there's a story actually that like I also had recounted in there, and like and like a journalist friend had told me about it because she had been doing research on this, and like it's about, and I also read it, like I'm trying to remember, right, because it was like a while ago, and it was like so it was a story that like of Jamal Basha, who came to like a village and they were trying to appeal to him and tell him like, we're starving and we're really hungry, and he asks, is there among you someone who has eaten their own child? And they said no. And he said, well, you're not really hungry then, are you? You know? And so it's this idea that like true, real hunger, like really is like you have to be brought to the point where you are willing to cannibalize somebody else, right? And other than that, like the elite will not look at you. They will not consider the fact that you are starving. They will not consider this as worthy of attention unless it is horrific. And so you tell the horrific stories, you know, because they are the metaphor for how awful you have been, you know, like for how terrible it is. Like you are starving. You don't need to eat your child to have to prove that you are starving, but you will tell the story of the neighbor who ate her child, hoping that people will now believe that you are all starving. And I just find that so incredibly wrenching, you know, like it's just so heartbreaking that like, you know, that people have to, you know, and like in Arabic, it's like قطع إيده شهد عليا. And you usually say that as like a sort of, you know, like you're making fun of the person, but like here it truly is like people had to cut off their own arms to sort of say, look, this is, you know, this is what we're going through. Like, please believe that we are truly suffering, you know? And I honestly feel like it's the same now. It's like, you know, I find it very hard to convey, you know, this idea of like, you know, when you say things like 60% or 70% of the population is now food insecure, you know, or is below the poverty line, or, you know, that there's no medicine to be had on the shelves, that, you know, like, what does that mean? What does that effectively look like inside a person's home, right? And inside a person's mind and within the family dynamic. And it's so hard to convey that. Like, it's so hard to convey the absolute like abject horror of every minute being like, every minute of your day is now strategized around survival, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, how do you convey that? You know, how do you convey how desperate people are for help? And by that same token, how great the crime that has been committed against them. You know, like when you say that the banks have been skimming money off of aid, or that they've been trying to, you know, it's how do you convey that, right? Like, this is for me part of the reason also why I feel like at a loss for words. Like, how do you explain the criminality of that and what it means for somebody to have so much, to be skimming money off, you know, these aid packages that are arriving, when literally at this point, like $3 can mean the difference between survival or not. Yeah. $3 you know, that's like 60,000 lira, or like actually at this point, it's almost 70,000, since, you know, it's.
Well, since the beginning of the conversation till now, it's probably, yeah, depreciated in a significant amount. Yeah, it's
there is
no 100%. Go ahead, Joy.
You know, it just to add, like, even the metaphor that you were talking about. I mean, one concrete way in which it's manifesting itself now, I know this from like relatives and friends, is, you know, the term that is now known as period poverty, of like, you know, basically, you know, Jesus,
menstrual hygiene.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have words. Like basically like sanitary products and, you know, all of these things being unaffordable, and when does it get talked about and when does it not get talked about, and, you know, all of these things. And of course that is a very obvious additional gendered component to these issues. One thing that I learned from, I think I first learned from the talk that you gave, Lina, and then I, you know, did other research, that there was even like when aid was sent, when it was allowed to go forward, that there was basically a decision as to who will receive the aid and what kind of criteria do they have to meet in order to receive the aid. And there was, you know, women who had quote unquote dishonored themselves did not get it. And there was, young, like children and the elderly didn't get it. And there was this kind of an ableist and an ageist, as now we would call them, these terms element. It's like, because they had to be prioritized, quote unquote, because they would be able to work the field in order to produce more food, etc., etc. And it was interesting. There's a short doc by Megaphone News. I will link all of this in the blog post, in which they quote Frederick Bliss, who was a charity worker who was actually born in Lebanon, I think, and he regretted this policy. He had heard about it. I think he participated. I don't know the details, but he had regretted the policy, and he himself described it as survival of the fittest, which now we would call basically like social Darwinism. And so these things were very much part of that, and it's one of the legacies in some ways of the famine, because people who are handicapped in Lebanon don't have any kind of access. People who have additional burdens, additional what have you, obviously the elderly who don't have any pensions anymore, all of these things, the kids who don't have access to education in the same way, all of these things will affect people. Everyone will get something, essentially. Everyone will be affected in a certain way, and some people will get affected even worse, or at least faster than the others. Like they would just be affected by, like, period poverty, for example, affected by it immediately, rather than in 6 months or in 1 year or whatever. That's something that immediately will, and obviously people with medicine issues or what have you. So just kind of like these components and how it just, and yet you think of everything we were just talking about now, that tends to be just kind of swept onto the rug, and we just talk about, well, this is what the Ottomans did, and all of the Lebanese were equally victimed, and there wasn't anyone who were victims a bit more, people who were suffering a bit more, or people who were taking advantage of it, obviously, as well as the families we're mentioning. I mean, the whole Jamal Pasha kind of saying this to these women, presumably he was then having lavish dinners, at the Sursock family later on, presumably. So these parallels continue. I think of the security guards.
He was rumored to bring his mistress actually to Michel Sursock's house. Like apparently, like that's where he could feel comfortable with his mistress, and they would have these dinners, and he would bring her, and yeah.
I just imagine like the security guards that must have existed around the mansion, and comparing that with the security guards in addition to essentially the entire state apparatus that the politicians will have, the private security, the private what are they called, the guardians of the parliament, that are basically the employees of Nabi Hibiri, and obviously Hezbollah and Dahi, all of these things, just the parallels are quite something. I guess I don't actually have any additional words to say other than saying it's insane that there are these many parallels.
Because it's just so insane. What are you going to add to it? Like what analysis, you know what I mean? Like you don't even have to point. It's just like so completely crazy. You're like, yep, that's what it is.
All you can do is draw parallels, right? Like as soon as you said that, I'm like, yeah, I remember seeing this graffiti in downtown Beirut not too long ago. It was after the blast, and it basically translates to, don't let a bastard who is full tell you to be patient about your hunger. And just, I mean, and there's this sense, like people will say it, on like TV interviews when they're super pissed, they'll say, like we're gonna come and eat you, like
we eat the rich. I mean, it's
it reminds me that
there's a reason why that's such a that's such a powerful slogan, right? Because it's like hunger as both reality and metaphor. And I feel, it's like you're almost made to feel stupid saying this, right? But like nobody should starve to death. Like it's nobody should starve to death. Like it's a complete crime. It's a complete horror that anybody starves to death, that anybody, has to think about feeding their child versus feeding themselves. Like it's like there's something very wrong with the world that people can starve to death, and that we're okay with that. And it's like, well, they just didn't have enough money to feed themselves. Like that's just completely insane,
I just thought of like the first day, like October 18th, when I went. So October 17th when the uprising started, I went in the morning. October 18th, there was this old woman, like very, very adorable, like Hajj woman, and she was being interviewed on TV, and she said, like, for every tree that is burned, we're going to burn a politician. I have that clip. I put it on Twitter somewhere. And so it's just one of those things. It obviously this is what's going to happen. That's why one good thing that I think has happened, or at least is is not as common after 2019, after the uprising, is this whole like etiquette of protest, which we heard a lot in 2015. Obviously, there was a lot of like, we have to protest, but like respectfully, like we have to be polite. We have, all of these things. In 2019, all of that went completely out of the window.
More so after the explosion. I mean, after the explosion,
yes.
I literally walked into Martyrs Square and saw gallows.
The gallows, yeah.
Hung in them, right? Including
there's still people who who will still use that, like yesterday the ISF had sort of put this thing where like they put this video of with the protests under Fahmi's house. At one point, one of the protesters went and he like broke all of the glass of like the building entrance in series of beautiful moves, really. Like he just went and he had a sharp thing and he knew exactly where to hit the glass, and he just did boom, 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 and it just like all fell. Just beautiful to watch, really. And a lot of people sort of came out and said like, this is too much, and like this is a destruction of property, and this is like, it's like it's just going too far, like breaking the glass. And you're always going to get these like respectability fucking assholes who are going to tell you that private property is like more important than people, and all of these things. But like I agree that like the protest etiquette has changed, but there are still a lot of people that will sort of admonish and hold any kind of like violence, and by violence I mean like breaking glass, as they hold it against the protesters.
But I think that is actually, if you want to talk about Lebanese coexistence, some of the most intense coexistence that I ever saw in this country was between peaceful protesters and rioters in the early days of the protests, and also after the August 4th blast, where it was basically like, listen, I don't want to break things, but I totally understand that other people do. And you had that dynamic. You had the dynamic of certain people who are not going to do that. Maybe they're old, maybe they're unwilling, but you also have the people in the front rows, and you really did have that sort of that really interesting dynamic that I always remember in my head as coexistence, because it's I feel is much more coexistence than the coexistence that Lebanese officials talk about, at least.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. It really is. I think breaking things is fantastic. Like just I really do. It's like whenever I go downtown now and I pass by Aswaq Beirut, there's like all of the tiles have been like ripped off the building, because that's like the bottom entrance of Parliament. So they've been like up until like, I guess like a good height, like where a human hand might be able to reach, like of a tall person. So all the tiles have been ripped off. And like, I always like when I walk there, I was telling like my husband the other day, I was like, I love to see that. I'm like, every single one of those tiles was thrown at a cop. And like that fills me with joy. Like when I see those tiles missing, I just think of like how people ripped off those tiles and like, they threw them at Shortat al-Majlis, and it's like, it's great. Anyway.
I will at some point have an activist called Vicky Osterweil on, and she wrote this really good book. She's this American anarchist activist. She's really amazing. And she has this book called In Defense of Looting. And she actually goes into these things. And the whole framework of what counts as violence and what counts as non-violence, a number of people, and I think I would agree with them, would actually reframe it as like what is lethal and what is not lethal. What is bodily injury and what is not. Because that's actually the difference. Yeah. Because on the one hand, you have the entire state, and on the other hand, you have broken glass. Like that's kind of what ends up happening, And I do agree that, sorry, quickly, like the whole etiquette thing, of course, relatives of mine, people I know are still on that thing, but there's definitely a bit more or a bit less of that, let's say. There's a bit more of people who, like when the ISF, that tweet that you mentioned, a bunch of people in the replies were saying, well, because they were saying that, I forgot what the exact terminology, but like, this crime happened overnight or what have you, in a very neutral status language. And people were saying, well, we have this crime to report from August 4th, that kind of thing. So there's very much of like, a sense of like, I don't know how to call it, like, at this point, like, what else are we going to, like, what is this etiquette serving? Like, what are we pretending that we're defending? What are these quote unquote civilized values, given that 200 plus people died in an explosion and we still there's no accountability, etc., etc. because obviously part of the protesters or people who started the protests were families and friends of those who died in that explosion. I don't know if I mentioned that before, so I just mentioned it now. Yeah, Timour, you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's an interesting, like, this idea that, you know, of being in defense of looting or violence. I think it's an interesting situation when people are literally more and more doing it out of self-preservation. I mean, people literally were killed and are being killed, at least slowly, via not having the medicine they need, or, you know, kids not having the nutrition they need, or et cetera, et cetera. And so, I mean, you know, I came across it repeatedly in my journalism, like from the beginning, that people really want the Lebanese leaders to die, you know, and why do they want them to die? Because they think their lives would be better if they were dead.
I think we can all agree on that, right?
I mean, you know, I'm a journalist, and a journalist,
we won't put the journalists in the spotlight, but I can say that, yeah.
That's true.
No,
yeah.
I would say that, like, most of the people I've come across would certainly support that, and would argue that yes, their lives would be better if these people were not around them.
Well, it's this idea also that people, you know, like, and we saw this slogan a lot, like after the blast, it's like, "Inno ma بدنا نحاسب بدنا ننتقم," like we don't want you know, we don't want accountability, we want revenge, basically, like at this point. And it's like, yeah, because people are very, very angry. And I think, you know, it's very interesting, Joey, this idea of like, well, what counts as violence is like, you know, it's the thing that I've been thinking about a lot. Again, metaphor becoming reality is like, you know, it's like ask anybody, like ask any poor person, and they will tell you that neglect is a form of violence, right? Like neglect is violence. And we saw that becoming real with the port explosion, right? Forget all the other forms of neglect and the violence that they have resulted in, whether it's like the empty pharmacies or, you know, the lack of electricity and the lack of food and the lack of all of these things, right? But like the fact that the port explosion was a result of great neglect and an abdication of responsibility. To me, like, again, this is one of those things where it's like, it also, like, you're like, oh, it blows my mind that like, you know, that we have such a stark illustration of that idea, you know, coming into, like, again, like coming out of the underworld, coming out of the world of metaphor, and like making itself known in these very material ways in like our actual lives. And yeah,
you know, I just think of, I had mentioned this on Twitter a couple of days ago. There's just a kind of how do you say this? The inability, maybe it's a structural inability for many people who cover the news, you know, Timour, not talking about you, who, you know, can't always use the same language being used on the streets, because there's always a certain, you know, different standards or different way of saying things. But that's not really the point. The point is that I've noticed many observers and analysts and others, usually non-Lebanese, but some Lebanese as well, don't want to kind of say how angry people are. Like they when it's like it is the same language of like accountability, lack of reforms, you know, more pressures from the West, sanctions, blah 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 blah. Whereas the stuff that I'm hearing from people that I know that were not may not particularly consider themselves political, maybe they're liberals, maybe, you know, broadly speaking, but they would not see themselves as radicals or leftists or whatever, actually saying like لازم يموتوا, like خلاص, they're just saying they have to die. Like it got to the point where people are kind of calculating their like the average lifespan of a human being and comparing it with how old the president and the speaker of parliaments are. You know, it's just there. And at some point, like I heard my own grandmother, who honestly does not usually swear, basically say this, like just like a couple of weeks ago. And this is someone who's like 85, you know, or 86 or something. You know, like it gets to the point where the anger, and it is independent of whether people think this is good or bad. It's irrelevant. This is just the reality on the ground. And at some point, if things are so bad, and obviously as bad as the Great Famine. I don't think it's as likely, just due to the different structures, and at the time being like everything being one crop, as you mentioned, Timour, in the introduction. Of course, we don't have that same world now, thank goodness, but it haunts. That haunts. The civil war haunts. The people who lost relatives at the explosion, obviously being joined by people who still, the families of the disappeared, as they're called, of during the civil war, are in conversations with one another. Like at some point, there's only so many people that you can bury, and so many things that you can hide, and so many things that you can, swipe under the rug, whatever the expression is. At some point, these things come back to the surface, and I do think, for me personally, and this is just my opinion, there has to be violence. Like, it just has to happen. It's just, I would hope that it's like maybe a bit more organized than disorganized, maybe more targeted at least than not targeted. Like, instead of at the cannon, go for the big ones, that kind of thing. But I understand. It has to come in the same thing that you said, Timour. One of the main images that I have in mind, I was one of the organizers in 2015. Not anything fancy, just I was speaking with the media, but I was part of the organizing team, and I definitely remember kind of like the many people from within, but also other people, usually middle class, being very uncomfortable with the shabib, quote unquote, right? Like with the people who would come in on their scooters from the neighboring neighborhoods and so on, usually from Dahi or whatever, and or Khandak al Rami or whatever, and not feeling comfortable with their presence. And in the October 2019, that whole first couple of weeks before kind of Nasrallah intervened, essentially, that we saw this more, and we saw more people being actually, I remember people applauding and clapping and just being actually celebrating that everyone, because we felt that, well, now it's a bit more representative. Now there's something more real about it. And for me, these
motorcycle boys.
The motorcycle boys, yeah, exactly. It's Shabib al-Motorcycle. It's like one of those. It's just one of those. I don't know if the word is litmus test. I'm not sure, but it's one of those indicators, at least, that when now the anger is representative and no one's anger is being policed by someone else. That's kind of the main thing that I guess I was getting at. And we're probably gonna see. That's my personal prediction. Like, we're probably gonna see more of it. Like, I think it's inevitable at this point.
We're seeing it on the streets right now. I mean, we're seeing increasing anger. There's protests tonight. Hadid is gone again. He came back. He's like, I'm here, but with principles, and it didn't work out.
Well, Timour has to leave us now because he has to go be a professional journalist, and Lina and I will continue a bit. And yeah, thanks a lot, Timour.
No, of course. Thank you so much for having me. Honestly, like, it's it was great to be on. I appreciate the podcast so much. I've like listened to several of the episodes. I'm like getting through it. If you want me to give a recommendation for 3 books,
go for it.
And it'll be a little bit like, they're a bit mismatched, but 2 of them are sort of about people, as you know, as we were talking about emigration, actually, they kind of came to mind about like, being stuck in between things, or between like being in a place and looking outside. And 2 books that were actually quite, I feel, influential for me when I had left high school and was entering uni, actually. I read these while I was hitchhiking through Eastern Europe. And so the first one is On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And it's like, a story about hitchhiking, but I think is quite, I mean, it definitely had an impact on me.
That's a lovely book. Yeah.
And the second one also is, I think, quite known. I'm not coming out of left field here, but is Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. And I read those actually right after each other. And they're both these stories about people, one very young, one sort of older, going out and trying to find, in a way, meaning or trying to understand, by virtue of leaving, where they were, or like who they are, what their origins are. And the third one is more of a boring one that I guess for like, I don't know, the journalists or analysts listening to this, a book that I thought was very useful for understanding like Beirut's reconstruction and sort of some of the reasons for the tensions in the city, is Citizen Hariri by Hannes Baumann, which is sort of a bit more of an academic text. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you, Lina, for the conversation as well. Great. Joey is showing the book on.
I have them. Yeah. I feel very cultured. I've read all 3 of them. Yeah. Sorry. Thanks a lot, Timour.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your conversation.
Thanks.
It was great to see you, Timour. Bye.
You too. Bye. وهلا عن جد bye. Sorry.
All right. Well, I mean, the only other thing I wanted to bring up was sectarianism. I find it's amazing we're three Lebanese having a chat, and this was not brought up, which is amazing. But like just because of the context in which Mount Lebanon happened and how memory is weaponized in Lebanon, I easily thought of remember Marion when the fires were happening, saying that these were only happening in Christian areas, even though they were actually happening mostly in Druze areas, but whatever. And of course, Mount Lebanon having this centrality in Maronite identity and Druze identity, of course, and just like the weaponization of memory. Like that's not actually the question. The question is when you yourself think about, let's say, the famine. I mean, since that's the main topic. For me, there's something very personal about it. Like it's just my great grandparent went through it. Essentially, like it's very, very direct. But for others, it's like, well, this is something that happened in Mount Lebanon. It's not something that happened in the South, although it did happen in the South as well. How do we remember these things while also taking into account whether they can be weaponized or not, if you see what I mean? Because that's sort of something I always worry about when I worry about talking about what Maronites went through 100 years ago a bit too much, because the people that tend to do this, let's say we don't share the same politics. And there's just this worry essentially of how easy something can be co-opted, even though it happened 100 years ago. Because actually, I remember Joanne Randanusho, she mentioned in her book, I forgot the title, I'll remember it and put it in the description and the blog post, of how even like the Armenian genocide was weaponized at some point a few years ago when you had Syrian Kurdish refugees in parts of Bush Hamoud, I believe. And of course, not everyone, but some Lebanese Armenians were actually using like Kurdish participation in the genocide 100 years ago to kind of justify discriminatory policies today. At least that was part of the stories that she was hearing. So like this happens across the board, of course. People use old stories in order to say something today. And due to the centrality of just like what we might call Maronite politics in the foundation of the state of Lebanon, and of course to this day, I want to talk about the Great Famine while also keeping that into account. And so it's a kind of a difficult thing, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's speaking of like also like the way that tragedy is sectarianized. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but like after the blast also, because, you're talking about the positioning of the grain silos, the fact that it destroyed a lot more of East Beirut than it did West Beirut. There was also very much this narrative of like, it's a Christian tragedy, much more than it is a Muslim tragedy. And like, of course, there was also the idea of like, oh, like the, especially like the Shia or like the people from Dahi, they don't care because it didn't happen to them because they were so far away from it. And then, and like I saw these accusations on social media, and then they were saying, well, you didn't care when 2006 was happening to us. When 2006 was happening, you were like out partying in Fareya and you were like clinking your glasses to like the bombs that were falling. And it's actually, I mean, it's just very sad when you see this kind of atomization, because for me, like, what you were talking about earlier about like the legacies of the war, this is something that I've like sort of kind of writing about it now. And it's not Haida, and the way that like we were all raised in different wars. Like I was going to ask you when you were talking about it, but then I didn't want to interrupt you. It was like, where were you geographically and physically during that time when there was that silence, right? Because you're like, okay, later on I heard about Jamblat, Birri, blah, blah, blah. Whereas like for me here, you couldn't avoid their names. It was there on the news all the time. You would hear it in the background constantly. But I also had like lacuna in my understanding of the war that later on, when I grew up, I was like totally shocked by it, right? Because I grew up in West Beirut. My parents were like Arab nationalists, not necessarily like very, like my mom was a communist and, but like in general, their leanings were very Arab nationalist. So for me, it's like, I don't think I even had a sense of it as like a civil war, to tell you the truth. It was more like, we are fighting for Palestine. We're fighting with the Palestinians. The Israelis want to expand into Lebanon. the way that and they're going to do to Lebanon what they've already done to Palestine. And because Palestine is the fundamental cause, we're all fighting for it. So I didn't know anything about Christian, Muslim, what this was, and then when I grew up, so we had our very, very close family friends. At one point, they were these twin boys that I used to hang out with all the time. And there was one summer where they went to camp in Switzerland, funnily enough. And I really wanted to go with them. And my mom was like, well, you can't. And I was like, well, why not? And I couldn't, then later I understood it was a Christian camp that their mom had sent them to because, but, and they weren't believers either. They were Christians and they were friends with my, but we didn't know their religion, but their mom was so desperate to get the kids out and to give them a normal summer outside. Right. So when they were oh, it's for these Christian Lebanese children, we're going to send them to camp, to sort of show them nature and have them sing songs about Jesus and whatever. And so she's like, all right, just take my kids, please. I don't care. Just get them out of Beirut, for a summer. And so, but what I mean to say is that the way that we were all raised in completely different wars and then when I encountered other people's wars, I was so shocked by them, really, truly shocked by them. And to realize the kinds of animosities that people had towards one another, because I think for me, the idea that I always had was oh, we don't have a national narrative, right, to unite us. We each have but the war is now our national narrative. The war is the thing that unites us because we all lived through it. And then you realize that you're no, we actually all live different wars. That is not the national narrative. And, and then it's you think 2006 is it's also not a national narrative. Even the explosion is not a national, it's not even a citywide narrative, everything is so atomized and fragmented. The famine, now you're talking about it, it's that's a national narrative, but it's who lays claim to the tragedy, right? And it sort of relates to what I was saying earlier about who is closest to the epicenter of pain and who is ignoring that pain, who is able to sort of turn a blind eye to it. And I honestly don't know how to repair that except maybe to insist on talking about it, and to insist on reframing it in certain ways, whether it's the Great Famine is we can not learn lessons because my God, people don't die for those reasons, but that we can sort of see the parallels and it's almost like the tracing paper of the past, place it over the topography of the present. And you see all of those places where it lines up, what can we understand from that? What can we understand from that repetition? And, how can we reframe these so that it does become even beyond a national narrative? It becomes a tragedy that belongs to everybody, to a certain extent. And there was actually one of the historians that I spoke to, a very interesting man who, when I was doing my research for this, spent a lot of time talking to me very generously. And one of the things that he said, this was a Christian tragedy, because that's essentially so much of the population was wiped out. And he was saying the reason that we don't talk about the famine as a central, what's the word, a foundational thing of the Lebanese state, right? It was actually it was a foundational myth of the Lebanese. Yeah. And because, he's instead we talk about the martyrs that were hung in Martyr Square, because that allows us to talk about this sort of united Lebanon. And because everybody is sort of afraid of anything that might sound sectarian, we don't talk about the famine as this one of these things that sort of fundamentally wrenched us away from the Ottomans and made us realize how what that occupation was and the price for that occupation and all of these things. And it was very interesting, it sort of stayed with me, that idea. And about not just about how stories are used, but about how in service of so-called unity, we don't talk about the specifics of particular tragedies and how they reverberated within particular communities and how they made people feel targeted, right? And I think we do a disservice to the people who feel that they are the primary victims of whatever it is by not talking about it in that way, or by completely ignoring that aspect of it, you know?
Yeah,
I don't think there's an easy answer for it, but like, you know, I mean, it's like, yeah. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's one of the things I say to kind of emphasize or to kind of describe I don't know how parochial my own childhood was, essentially, how just small the world was, so small essentially until I described 2005 as like infitah. Like it's just I discovered all of these names all at once. Is that for me the word muqawama was the Lebanese forces. I actually grew up like around, like just all around me, like the neighborhood, the you know, the buildings, posters, what have you. That was the term al-muqawama al-Lebaniyya in my mind, like the Lebanese resistance as a term meant them. After like, I don't know, 2005, of course by 2006 I had already learned that there was actually another muqawama that's actually bigger and just more well known, maybe across the world even. But for me, that's kind of like was my background in some ways, and it's for that, like, you know, in retrospect, of course. But now in my own research, I don't really use civil war in the singular. I don't even use the word civil. I just say Lebanese wars. It's in the plural, and the reason for that is pretty simple, because when we start talking about the post-war, usually we start in 1990. But the entire South was still occupied until 2000.
Absolutely.
And so for many people, the post-war started in 2000, really, not really in 1990, if you see what I mean. And of course, there are people who will say, well, actually 2005 with the expulsion of the Syrian troops. There's just these multiple narratives, because for me, you mentioned 2006 and where were you and stuff. For me, 2006 was just like the month we had to stay at home. I knew things were bad, and my mom, like, we had the news on and everything, and there was this sense that this was happening to us, but we were safe. Like, my house wasn't, at no point was it under any risk. It was in Mount Lebanon and whatnot, and I was told that by my mom. I mean, undoubtedly because she wanted to just make me feel better and stuff, but she would tell me, like, don't worry, we're not being targeted. Don't worry, this is not about us. And she was right, of course, it was not about us. That was actually part of something I learned later on. For me, back then, I was told, especially by my grandmother, that the us bit was actually what happened in 89 and 1990, when our house was partially bombed by the Syrian regime at the time, during the whole on thing. What he called the War of Liberation, obviously. And that's why there was just this gap. And it took me some time, 2005, 6, until I went to AUB in 2010, 11. That's when those 5 years basically is when I started learning about Lebanese history. Before that, I just had like my neighborhood, my area, vaguely, like Beirut was foreign, like Mount Lebanon was the place, and that's it. And for me, those are the interesting multiple narratives and multiple stories of when they're not talked about in the same context. It feeds off the whole, like, you know, to use an obvious example, like Hezbollah saying, I'm your protector, you know, to many Lebanese Shias. It feeds that narrative when non-Shias in Lebanon don't recognize the specific problems that I'm saying Shia, just simplifying. Like people from the South in general, obviously Christians and Sunnis as well. So, you know, not recognizing that there was this specific thing that happened for a longer period of time while the rest of the country was quote unquote rebuilding and this whole economic miracle and whatnot. The occupation continued until 2000. And, you know, so on and so forth. Just one obvious example. Those are the difficult things that are very difficult. Like I struggle. I spend so much time in my own research, and that's like a PhD. So I have the luxury and the time to sit down and do slow research and whatnot. So much of it is just sitting down. It's like, well, how am I going to call this? Like, how am I going to, which word am I going to use? Am I even going to use post-war? And if I am, would I put it in quotations? You know, all of these things. And that's just like one person doing one work in English. You know, that's one thing as well, another limitation. It's just, you know, all of these things. And that's why for me, the Great Famine, I feel, due to the worry and just the worry of sounding like you know, parochial and just a Christian thing, and or this is just a Mount Lebanon thing or whatever. It took me some time to actually want to look into it properly as just a part of the history, a huge part of the history. And
huge part of the history. And also, I mean, the way that maybe this is my upbringing, because like I said, my mother was a communist, and she was like a spiritual communist. You know what I mean? It wasn't so much like, it was this very much this idea of like, nobody should go hungry. This is obscene,
Yes,
and like we acknowledge the obscenity of that. And so that like, and I think that's why like what drew me to the fan was sort of that deliberate elite rich person, I'm going to profit off of this. And so the way that I see the famine also is very much a history of that, it's the history of the grain trade, it's the history of monopolies, it's the history of, of the way that how poverty is made, how starvation is made, how, people exploit situations in order to make money and become rich. And so like, yes, there were a lot of, like you could read it in terms of like Lebanese history. And I think it's important to sort of like not ignore, let's say, the sectarian component of it, right? But by that same token, it's also like, for me, it's like it's a capitalist crime, right? Like it's a crime of, that's essentially what it is. It's about like the subjugation of the poor by the rich, and sort of the deliberate impoverishment of people. And, so for me, that's like another way to read it as well, that is like sort of outside sectarianism, like it transcends that, and it does, because like, if you look at it, it's like at the time also, it's like Mount Lebanon, but it was very much connected to Syria, and it was connected to Greater Syria. And I find like, it's interesting when you start to put these like fragmented narratives together, or like lay them on top of each other, like, for example, so when I first, like the first job that I got, I was working in an advertising agency, and it was like in Ain al-Ramid, like right over like where Tayuna is. And it was like all the buildings were destroyed. It was destroyed. And it was the first building that was like, and it was not far from where the bus massacre had taken place. And like, this is like 99. So it's still very fresh, like very, very fresh, and so I worked in this place, and like most of the people that worked there were Christians. Okay. And so I had grown up, like I said, I didn't really know, I didn't know anybody who was like necessarily like religious, and that's not true, but like, so I didn't know Christians who weren't leftists. Let's put it that way. This is the first time that I was meeting like Lebanese nationalist Christians. I'm not going to say they were all right wingers, but like a bunch of them were right wingers, right? This is the first time that I encountered the Lebanese nationalist narrative. And I was very shocked by their enmity toward the Palestinians, right? Like this for me was something that was very shocking, because like the Palestinian cause is the most noble thing, and what you blame the Palestinians for the war. This was really the first time that I had ever encountered that, which I think would probably shock them, right? But at the same time, like listening to what they said, obviously there were many things that I disagreed with, but like I had to also acknowledge that they had a different experience of that. Like one of them had his father had been kidnapped by Palestinian guerrillas and then murdered, right? And I'm not saying anything new. It was just like, it was like laying these narratives on top of each other, and sort of seeing how they fit in together was really like, it was a thing that I had to learn how to do. And I think that we all have to learn how to do it, right? It's not a thing that comes naturally to us. And it's not because of all of these silences, because of the ways things were not explained to us. And, it's like in those gaps is where all of the horrible things can fester. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm sort of thinking aloud with you right now, but like.
It does. I remember the very, very awkward. It was definitely awkward the way it was. It was some Lebanese show. I don't remember. but there was a person, she was very pro Hezbollah, and she was talking with someone who was very pro Uwait. So this is the kind of coexistence that I don't think is healthy. But she was saying like, mukawame, like resistance, we sacrifice, something along those lines. And then he said, well, there is someone else we also call ourselves the Mukawame or something like that. And then she said something along the lines, I will always remember this because I feel like she just had to say it on the spot, that she didn't actually believe it. And she basically said, like, we need to respect each other's resistance. We need to respect each other's Mukawames. It's like, I don't think you mean that, but I guess maybe that's a starting point. I don't know, but it's just one of those things that it had to happen on the spot. They didn't rehearse. But these conversations that are very messy, very almost definitely you're going to maybe accidentally say something that's insensitive or whatnot, because the separation between communities and between peoples and between neighborhoods and whatnot are just so rigid at times. But it has to be part of the process as well. For me, it took me some time. There was never any kind of, I have this one aunt who we decided to basically ignore her because she's very pro-Israel. But it took me some time, not her, but it took me some time to understand. Okay, let me put it differently. The reason why I was never fully into the whole Lebanese nationalist camp is because my dad and my mom were both rescue workers during the Civil War. And my dad witnessed the Sabra and Shatila massacre. He was there during it as one of the Red Cross volunteers. And that's something that, even though I didn't know much about the war and everything, there was just the sense of like bad things happened and bad people were all over. That was kind of very vague, like just that's, and so that kind of protected me in some sense from when the whole it's funny because in the episode before that's gonna come out before this one, I also told the same story. But when 2005 happened and there was the comeback of both On and Jaja, within a few months of one another, when Jaja came out of prison and On came back from exile, I was in St. Clair Najm, very Christian school. And there was people, when they were picking up, like parents, when they were picking up their kids, they were saying there was these honks, that kind of shit.
Oh
And
yeah.
I had no idea what I didn't know who the fuck Hakim and General. I had not heard I knew their names maybe, but I didn't make that connection of why they were important or whatever. And I had told the story time and time again of like, I asked my mom, like, are we with the Uwait or with the Aouniya? And she stopped the car and yelled at me and whatever. But that was because in school, like, suddenly people had to decide, and it was still in the early months, before On and Hezbollah did their deals, right? Where there was kind of like Aouni and Uwait can kind of still be buddies. It was still a bit okay. Like we hate the Syrians. Like, oh, okay, we can kind of.
That's what unites us.
Yeah, that's what like there was these few months and so when that was still kind of allowed or whatever. But yeah, it's just. And these stories for me, like my mom yelling at me, my schoolmates asking me like, are you with On or Jaja, whatever. Those things for me are way more potent in some ways than just reading a history book that says between 1975 and 1976 this happened, and that, it's important and people need to know the basic facts as well, but it's just so much more than that. I guess the entire point of this conversation is that it's just so much more than just Ottomans did this 100 years ago and everyone else suffered, rather than a lot of people did suffer, but it was not just the Ottomans. It was just much more complicated than that. And yeah, all of these things, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tab, on the cheerful note of the Great Famine, Jesus. If it's okay with you, we'll kind of wrap it up with like the book section, in which I ask kind of like what Timour did very quickly. Just like your 3 books to our listeners, what are they and like why?
Yes. Okay. So 3 books so the first one is, I already mentioned it before. It's Beirut Nightmares by Ghada Saman. And, she's one of these people who she doesn't get necessarily a lot of credit. I mean, maybe that's an unfair statement, but like I think she's dismissed sometimes for many reasons. And one of them is because she's like written so many books and, but like this book, I've been reading it. Like I pick it up and I open it to like various different pages and I read it. And it's like I'm finding a lot of comfort in it, weirdly, even though it's incredibly depressing. And like I said, it like what it shows you is just that recurrence of history. And but at the same time, I'm feeling like I'm able to, it's almost like you pick it up and you're like, oh, you understand what I'm going through. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not just when I speak, like today really felt like a kind of catharsis, like sort of sitting there and trying to articulate these things and, and so picking up this book, I feel that as well. Like I open it and I read these debates, and it's not debates like she's writing, but like there's certain points where she like externalizes the internal debates that she's having, like that whole thing of like, who is innocent, when you don't stand up to a tyranny, like who is innocent in a society like that. So yeah, so Beirut Nightmares, because basically we're living now another Beirut nightmare. And so there's that. I also recently read a book by Hisham Matar. He's the Libyan writer whose father was disappeared, and he wrote The Return, which was like a memoir of him going back to Libya and sort of trying to understand what happened to his dad, so his most recent book, it's like a nonfiction, it's almost like a long essay. It's called A Month in Siena. And it's about him going to Siena, Italy to look at some paintings. But essentially, I mean, that's like the book, but it's just this incredibly beautiful meditation. Like it's, again, I think like on all his books is to a certain extent about his father and like his father's disappearance, like this great absence. But it's about, I think, while his other books have been about like exploring the gaping hole left behind, this book is kind of about like how you fill it. And it's essentially about art and love and, and family and how you make family. And it's just such a beautiful book. And he's such a beautiful writer. So that's my other. So A Month in Siena by Hisham Matar. And the third book that I would recommend is a book by, no relation, a poet named Mira Matar, a poet and writer named Mira Matar. She's a Lebanese Palestinian poet, and she lives in the UK. And we had talked on Twitter, and then she said, she wanted to send me her book. So she had cited something that I had written in her book of poetry. And she sent me the latest book of poetry, but she also sent me another book she had written called Yes, I Am a Destroyer. And I just wrote to her and I was telling her, like, thank you so much for this. It's just a fantastic book. It's like, it's a prose poem, but it's kind of a novel, but not really. But it's like, I'm finding also like a lot of just, it's one of those books also that you can read cover to cover, but you can also open it up and like read anywhere in it. And I find that it's very hard for me to read linearly these days because my mind is so scattered. I mean, the Hisham Matar book, I read it in like one sit down because it's like not very long. But yeah, this is just a lovely book. I really like, it's beautifully written. It's very weird. Like in the best way possible, right? Like it sort of like breaks all of these narrative structures, and like I'm really enjoying it. So like I think that if people can find it, it's published by the Constellations. No, sorry, what does it say? It says Ma Bibliothèque, I think. Yeah. And yeah, Yes, I Am a Destroyer. And the Constellations is like the series of the book, but
I'll find the link anyway
as well.
I'll find the link anyway. Well, amazing. Well, Lina, thanks a lot for your time. This is, I think, the longest episode I've done so far, but this was amazing.
This was fantastic. Thank you so much. My voice is gone now, I think, but like, I really enjoyed it. I always enjoy talking to you so much, really. It's like really, I forget that we're recording, and, I have to say, I've never re-listened to the episode after the blast. And I'm like actually really afraid to listen to it. Like I recall that I was incredibly unhinged, and I was like just totally, so maybe one day I'll bring myself to be able to like listen to that.
I re-listened to it recently. It's pretty good. No, you don't sound unhinged, honestly. It's emotional for sure, but the message is, it comes across essentially.
Anyway, but I guess I wanted to thank you for like, that's very selfish because it's like, but yeah, and just thank you for this podcast in general. Like I don't come across conversations like this or with the guests that you choose as well. Like, I've gotten to know so many different people and so many different ideas, and like, it's stuff that actually, it's not a cheap word, but like it does give me hope, like in the sense like you realize like there's so many brilliant people who are like just thinking very hard about how to make the world a better place. And that that really makes me feel like, okay, there's
no, I have that sense myself from a number of the guests, the way they think, the way it's I do it like I would I would record a number of episodes, do the research required, and then it's a purely selfish thing. I just want to re-listen to it again when I'm having certain thoughts and whatnot. I'll tell, that person actually solved that question, and I'm gonna re-listen to it now. So it's a purely selfish endeavor. Lina,
we
thanks a lot.
Thank you for it, and thank you. This was great. Yalla, take care.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.